But yeah, so that, I mean, I think that's interesting to talk about. I mean,
Actually, believe it or not, still 150 seats.
right.
So they still had 100 seats in your house, in the state house, and 50 seats in the state senate. And it's been like that at least since 1921. Before, when it was a territory, it was just a couple dozen people because there was a couple thousand people that lived here. But when Montana entered statehood in 1889, they had redistricted the population or re-census the population and was able to come up with 100 House seats and 50 Senate seats. And it's pretty much been like that for 120 years now.
I feel like watching redistricting and the committee hearings that have gone on the last couple of years feel like that would have been a nightmare 120 years ago.
Well, which is funny is back then, like there used to be an even split in population between the east and west. Like today in Montana, you see the eastern side of Montana is very rural, very agricultural focused.
Shout out my home.
Yep, and the western side of Montana is very urban, Montana urban, so it's like a suburb compared to like real urban city centers. But it's a urban area that relies more on the service industry and technology and just like commerce, whereas in the eastern side of Montana, it relies heavily on agriculture and resource extraction industries more than anything.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to look at.
Yeah, but back then it used to be an even divide, where the eastern side of the state was just as populous as the western side of the state. But that divide still existed. You had the major cities, but those major cities in the state of Montana at this time relied heavily on the copper and gold and silver industries that were the original uh, prospecting towns that became boom bust towns, the ones that stayed around. So like Helena, Bannock, Butte, yep. All of those towns and cities relied on the extraction industry, but eastern Montana was all farms and ranches until, of course, the 1920s, when people just started moving away from eastern Montana. And so you can actually see a lot of like the politics of the time really reflect that, especially the fear of losing the family farm that you have for a generation.
Yeah.
You didn't really want to lose your livelihood or move to a city.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and so
are we still in the 1920s?
We're going in the 1930s. We'll fast track this one. Yes.
Oh my.
Well, it goes a lot easier now because after the 1920s, really people began kind of blaming the national administrations for this. So we actually see this change to the New Deal program. So in 1933 is really the first time like the Democrats actually won seats in the state legislature and actually were starting winning seats across pretty much all of the state offices.
And is this, do we still have many parties at this 1930s juncture?
Yeah, so in the 1930s you start seeing those parties go away, or rather, instead of going away, they start forming in umbrellas of the other parties. Oh. So all like the Farm Labor Party or the Progressive Party falls under the Democratic Party, and all the other parties fall under the Republican Party. I mean, so they pretty much become more lockstep with each other through the New Deal, because that was kind of what they needed to do to get the New Deal passed nationally, was to take all these different coalitions and form one group to get such massive and changing legislation passed, both nationally and locally, like within the state. And so you can see that reflected in Montana's voting politics, because from 1933 all the way to World War II is a complete democratic victory, or not victory, but control and hold over all state politics, right? Because we all have that like anecdotal idea that the party switched in the 1960s with Reagan, but in Montana you don't really see that. Like the parties kind of they are different today as they were 100 years ago, but like they haven't changed as dramatically as we like to think with the 1968 Reagan, or not Reagan, but the Nixon switch and the silent majority coming up to fill the Republican Party.
There was the post-war or Civil War shift in the parties. That was the big part where the parties really completely flip-flopped their ideas and the ideals and the things they stood for. Both parties have changed their stances on certain things.
Right, and I think
the last, year or so.
Yeah, and I think like during this time, because all these independent parties existed prior to the 1940s, when the two major parties absorbed them, they had to change like their party platform to get them to come into their side, to avoid having 16 independents and 12 Democrats and 8 Republicans and 5 constitutionalists and 5 Farm Labor Party members and 5 progressives and 2 Bull Moose Party members. They had to find a working coalition to get everyone into the same umbrella. And so I think the parties really had to change.
I want to be.
I
don't know. I don't know what it means, but I think
it's like the Bull Moose Party today is what we would call what was called progressive back then. They were the progressive party, but like they were different progressives. Yeah, Teddy Roosevelt, he was under the antitrust party. So there was an antitrust party in Montana, and their entire party platform was like break up monopolies, break up the copper monopolies that pretty much strangled the state. Because like even in Montana, you learn about like the days of the state legislature where copper barons would walk around the state capitol and give out $100 bills to people to vote on bills that would either break their monopoly or strengthen their monopoly on the copper industry.
Back in the good old days.
Back when politicians were real about what they wanted.
Oh yeah.
And where $100 could buy you a seat.
That's all very, very interesting.
Yep. Yeah, and so but once World War II starts and all the men go off to fight the war again in Montana, a lot of men from Montana not supplied, but it sounds like they're just cattle off to slaughter.
I mean, that's kind of what a draft is.
It was kind of
essentially what it was. But there was all volunteer in Montana. Tons and tons of men from the state of Montana volunteered for the armed services and armed forces during World War II. I mean, that's when you kind of see like the politics of the time changed. In 1943, like the New Deal pretty much saved the family farm, right? Everyone remembers the New Deal as saving the family farm because it pretty much subsidized small family farm and family agriculture, which is very often overskipped when you talk about the New Deal program in that time frame. Everyone talks about the Tennessee Valley Authority or the hundreds of thousands of others acronyms that the New Deal programs made it, but they rarely ever talk about like the small family focused or subsidies that save states like Montana and Wyoming and North and South Dakota that couldn't, go build a dam somewhere, even though we did. Canyon Ferry Dam is a prime example of that, of the TVA here in Montana.
What was that? What's that acronym?
TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority.
Tennessee Valley Authority. We'll talk about that later.
It's not the Time Variance Authority.
No.
This isn't Loki.
Yeah, but it's like so the New Deal created thousands of different government agencies, and of course Republicans at the time even were against that. They did not want the expansion of the federal government to overtake all these little aspects of civil society.
Right.
But the Democrats at the time thought it was necessary to get the country out of the Great Depression. Because by the 1930s, the rest of the country fell into the Great Depression. The Dust Bowl was actually cared about because there were states like Nebraska and Kansas and Ohio were now feeling the Dust Bowl, but Montana had been feeling the Dust Bowl for 10 plus years now. No one really, we don't call the 1920s the start of the Dust Bowl, but for Montana it was.
And they didn't have the medications for depression as they did back then.
Not until the 1950s.
And that was even sketchy back then.
Even
so there's
then
no cure except
it was pretty much just meth at that point.
I mean, they had real Coke, so
yeah.
I mean,
I guess.
And so like Montana's landscape really reflects that, or political landscape really reflects that. And so at the very onset of World War II for the United States, you see this change from this Democrat control to a Republican control. It almost like happened practically overnight. Like the Democrats used to have majorities in both chambers, and then one election later, the Republicans had super majorities in both chambers. And so like you saw this reflection that once the country was moving out of the Great Depression, Montana was already moving out of the Great Depression thanks to a lot of the New Deal programs. The new political movement was that people were afraid that the government was going to begin controlling more aspects of civil society, and so control on that was to vote for Republicans, even though, of course, the state had benefited significantly from the New Deal and Democratic proposals.
So Democrats saved the state and the family farm and the individual people, and then Republicans turn it against them, make the big government the boogeyman, and take over everything.
Yeah, and so like it's very surreal today because that's the exact same thing that's going on right now. But like what's really funny to me, and like for modern politics, for today politics, Democrats have basically just abandoned Eastern Montana. I think they have pretty much forgotten what saved the family farm, and they just do not go to Eastern Montana anymore. And they're the ones that pretty much saved it to where it is at today. And we can go into a lot more.
Well, does anybody understand what a farm is? happens.
Yes.
What happens on a farm?
What is a farm?
I'm pretty sure our senior senator knows what a farm is.
Yeah, our senior Democratic senator
That's true.
knows about farms pretty well.
Yeah. And so going back to like why the Republicans were so great at this time was because they promised like none of the stuff the New Deal came was going to go away. They said we're going to keep all of that for you. They just didn't want to expand anymore because the state was coming out of its Great Recession, coming out of the Dust Bowl. Everything got us through, and people were kind of just like pumping the brakes on the New Deal. And you can see this nationally with it's Johnson in the 60s with his Great New Deal or his New Society. Like people were not super susceptible to his like continuing the New Deal or expanding it. They just wanted to keep what was already there because that stuff was proven to work and they weren't going to try something else. And so from pretty much World War II all the way up until the 70s, you see this political landscape of what Montana has always been super proud of, and especially older generations of Montanans will tell you this. They're very proud of their split ticket voting. For the like these next like 30 years, both chambers and the governorship would jump back and forth between Republican and Democrat, Democrat and Republican. There was very ever a time where both chambers were under the control of the same party. It would be for one election, then several elections, there would just be Democrat-Republican split. And these weren't just like 2-3 vote splits. These would be 10, 15, 20 vote splits in both chambers. So they would shift dramatically back and forth between them.
Yeah, that's a common thing in like politics nationally, but it seems to be a little bit more dramatic here in Montana.
Right. Like you normally would have like such splits of like, oh, they're like 5 or 6 seats, you lose 5 or 6 seats, gain like 3 or 4 seats. But in Montana, they'd be losing 20, 30 seats, and the opponent would be picking up 20, 30 seats in these elections. And this is a really small state where elections were decided by like hundreds, if not dozens of votes.
Small population-wise.
Yes. It's the 4th largest state in the Union with like the 41st largest population. And the other thing at this time too, Montana always had a congressional seat. We didn't lose it until like the 70s, 80s.
Nice.
Right. What's other funny at this point in time too, though, is like, and this is just really more of the type quality of candidate that we're sending. So this is like Montana's heyday for this time period from 45 to pretty much the 70s was the heyday for Montana's politics nationally. We sent some of the biggest recognizable names in the state of Montana, at least, to the U.S. Congress, which is Mike Mansfield and Lee Metcalf.
Uh-huh.
I've heard of them.
Yeah, so you've heard of them. Yeah,
pretty sure I've been to a dinner with that name on it somewhere.
Yep, their names are plastered on just about every major government building in the state of Montana.
There's like some state park stuff.
Yeah, there's some parks named after them. They are pretty much the biggest political players in Montana's history, as politics goes. I mean, they were both Democrats that came from the state. And so even during this time of upheaval of switching parties back and forth for both House chambers, on a statewide basis, they were constantly electing Democrats as the representatives, but then the governorship would always flip back and forth. During times of like Democrat control in the House or Senate, there would be a Republican governor, and then when the Republicans had the House or Senate, there would be a Democratic governor. And that would go all the way up about until the 80s, and then in the 80s, when Reagan was elected nationally, the Republicans kind of did well in the 81 election, 83, but after 1983, the Democrats took over. So while Reagan and the Republicans were enjoying their national spotlight of controlling the Congress and being in the national news and headlines everywhere.
Laying the groundwork to destroy the country as we know it.
For some people. Democrats in the state were taking back over, or taking control of the state and state house and state legislature and the governorship at the same time. And then it really wouldn't come ahead until 1991-93 with the election of Bill Clinton. That was probably the first time the state of Montana voted for a Democrat since Nixon, and they would never make that mistake again. And I don't think a Democrat's ever taken the state nationally or statewide for the president since Bill Clinton.
Obama almost had it in 08, I think.
He almost did, but he's barely lost out. Probably the closest. And so they would...
by far the closest.
Yeah, by far the closest. They would... The people of Montana would never vote for a Democrat for president since Bill Clinton. And rightfully so. But this is also...
Do you think Bill Clinton want us all over with the saxophone skills, or what do you think?
We don't have to get. We don't have to get. We don't have to get Bill. He doesn't. He does not deserve
No.
the conversation.
No, he does not.
But really, after Bill Clinton's elected, is when you start